Picture this: on an ordinary day in a quiet neighborhood, something unexpected happens. One man, full of prejudice, accuses his black neighbor of stealing packages. The conflict escalates, leading to the police being called. But when law enforcement arrives, true justice begins to emerge. How do you think this story will end? Write in the comments where you are watching from and what your thoughts are about what is happening in this video. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the ending of this exciting story. In a quiet neighborhood, where birds sing and neighbors chat in the morning, an unexpected scandal erupted. One of the residents, known for his prejudiced views, suddenly announced that his black neighbor, whom he, by the way, practically did not know, stole packages from his porch. This man, however, had long been a cause for concern for those around him with his behavior, but no one imagined that his prejudice could lead to such serious consequences. The report of a theft, backed up by an accusation against a neighbor, attracted the attention of the police. When law enforcement officers arrived on the scene, the situation was far from simple as expected. Despite the lack of evidence and clear indications that the accusations were unfounded, the tension in the air was palpable. The accused himself, unperturbed and calm, was forced to endure humiliation and suspicions that turned out to be completely unfair. When the police began investigating, facts emerged that shocked everyone. It turned out that the real culprit of the theft was none other than the accuser himself. He used his influence and social status to create the appearance of a threat from an innocent neighbor. All of these actions were part of a larger scheme aimed at maintaining stereotypes and preconceived notions about black residents of the area. Gradually, as the truth was revealed, justice was restored. The person who had once used racial bias to achieve his goals was brought to the center of an investigation and ultimately punished for his actions. This event became an important lesson in how easy it is to fall into the trap of one's own biases and the importance of combating racism at all levels of society. So what started out as a simple accusation turned into an important reminder of the need to combat bias and racism that can still lurk beneath the surface, even in the most mundane and peaceful places. When the police arrived, they found that the conflict between the two neighbors had reached a critical point. The differences between them were not new, but this theft charge brought the situation into sharp focus. The racist accuser, who was known for his disregard for differences, clearly took this opportunity to confirm his biased beliefs. The black neighbor, James, found himself at the center of this chaos. He was a man of good character, always helping others and never causing trouble. But unfortunately, in the eyes of his racist neighbor, he was guilty simply because his skin was darker. James was shocked by how quickly public opinion and officialdom began to doubt his innocence. His world, once stable and safe, suddenly found itself at the epicenter of injustice. While the police were investigating, the accuser, Mr. Smith, used his connections to manipulate the situation to his advantage. He claimed to have seen James on CCTV, although according to a technician, the footage was not clear enough to identify the men. Smith continued to press his case, focusing on the racial stereotypes that unfortunately still existed in society. James, feeling the pressure mounting, decided to seek help from a human rights organization. Together with a lawyer and a group of activists, he began collecting evidence to prove his innocence. He also attracted the attention of the local media, hoping that public opinion could influence the outcome of the case. Unfortunately, the media could not escape the influence of racial bias, and James had to fight not only the accusations, but also biased reporting. The climax came on the day of the trial. The public hearing attracted the attention of many, including human rights defenders, activists, and even local residents who had previously remained silent. In court, Smith spoke aggressively, trying to intimidate everyone with his influence and authority. James, despite his anxiety, stood firm and presented evidence of his innocence. James's lawyer also showed video footage from other surveillance cameras, which proved that James could not have been at the crime scene at the time. The trial was a real ordeal. During the trial, witnesses testified that Smith had repeatedly made racist remarks and had a history of making unsubstantiated accusations. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. Emotional statements from James and his defense, the charges, and Smith's attempts to save face made the trial dramatic and memorable. Eventually, the truth came out. The court found James not guilty and ruled that Smith should be held accountable for his actions. The verdict was a major victory not only for James, but for the entire community, which saw how prejudice could be overcome and justice achieved. Smith was sentenced to community service and fines, and his reputation was severely damaged. This story showed how destructive racist bias can be and how important it is to fight against it. It was a reminder that even in the most difficult times, justice can prevail if you fight for it. James, although he went through a lot of suffering, came out of this ordeal with a sense of pride and determination to continue fighting for equality and justice. After the verdict was announced and James was found not guilty, a wave of change began in the area where the incident took place. The community was shocked at how easily prejudice could ruin an innocent man's life, and the event galvanized locals into action. James, while relieved that justice had been served, was deeply weary of the experience. He and his family faced social isolation and economic hardship while the investigation continued. Support from friends, family, and human rights groups was invaluable, but there was still much work to do to restore social harmony. While James was trying to recover and get his life back on track, he and his lawyer began working to prevent similar incidents from happening in the future. They organized meetings with local government and educational institutions to discuss racism and how to combat it. James spoke at community forums, shared his experiences, and called for bias education and awareness programs. At the same time, support groups and local initiatives to strengthen intercultural relations began to form in the area. The authorities conducted trainings for police officers and civil servants to improve their understanding of issues of racism and stereotypes. These steps were part of a wider reform program aimed at strengthening trust between different groups of the population. But even amid these positive changes, James faced personal challenges. Returning to normal life was not as easy as expected. His family life was also tested. Constant media attention and public pressure had left their mark. He and his loved ones tried to cope with the aftermath of what they had experienced and find ways to repair the relationships that had been damaged by the conflict. At the same time, James found solace in the fact that his fight was not in vain. He began receiving letters of gratitude from people who had been inspired by his story to fight for justice in their own lives. These letters brought him joy and confidence that his efforts had made a positive difference. As time passed, James was able to find a new direction in his life. He launched a project aimed at creating a safe space for people to share their ideas and experiences when they encounter racism and bias. This project not only helped people find support and resources, but also helped spread an important message about the need to combat bias and racism. With each passing year, James became increasingly aware that his personal tragedy had become a catalyst for change in society. His story reminded people that everyone has the right to justice and respect, regardless of skin color or social status. And although the path to complete justice was long and difficult, James continued to move forward, inspired by the hope for a better future. His case became a lesson for many: how important it is to fight for the truth, how necessary it is to work to change social prejudices, and how personal trials can lead to great transformation of society. As James began to recover and adapt to his new life, he continued to work actively on his project and fight against prejudice in society. However, his peace was shattered by an unexpected turn of events. One day, an old acquaintance approached him and reported strange actions on the part of Mr. Smith, the former prosecutor. It turned out that after the trial, Smith was trying to find ways to take revenge. James and his lawyer learned that Smith had begun spreading rumors and false accusations about James in an attempt to undermine his reputation and discredit his project. Smith's interference became more acute when he began using his connections and resources to create a situation that would put James in jeopardy again. James felt his work and efforts were beginning to crumble. He began receiving threats and found his project vandalized. One day, his office was found in disrepair, doors broken, equipment vandalized, and all of his important documents lost or destroyed. It seemed that Smith would stop at nothing to get revenge. However, this unexpected blow became a decisive moment for James. Instead of retreating, he gathered all his resolve and turned to his allies and supporters for help. He organized a press conference in which he revealed the whole truth about Smith's actions. This event attracted the attention of the general public and the media, which began investigating Smith's activities. The key moment came when James provided irrefutable evidence showing how Smith had used his connections to commit illegal acts. Documents and evidence collected by James and his team showed that Smith had not only tried to destroy James' reputation, but had also been involved in other illegal schemes. Following public pressure and an investigation, Smith was arrested and charged with several crimes, including defamation, threats and vandalism. The trial against him attracted widespread attention and became a milestone in the fight against corruption and racism. James, although he suffered another blow, emerged victorious. He rebuilt his project and even expanded it to cover a wider range of social issues. His story attracted even more attention and support from the public and activists, who helped him continue his work to create a more just society. The unexpected turn of events showed that even in the most difficult circumstances, one can find the strength to fight and overcome obstacles. James's story became an inspiration to many who face injustice and prejudice. It reminded them that resilience and determination can overcome even the most difficult challenges. As James rebuilt his project and dealt with the aftermath of Smith's attack, he found that his story had become an important part of the fight for justice. There had been a significant shift in public consciousness. Local and national media, engulfed by the Smith scandal, began to actively cover the issues of racism and discrimination raised by James's case. Press conferences, articles, and talk shows brought important topics that had previously been overlooked into the public conversation. But as James built community ties and worked to rebuild his project, he faced new challenges. As he worked to restore his reputation, parts of the community began to resist his efforts. The resistance manifested itself in violent confrontations and even violence from groups that could not accept the change or feared the loss of their privileges. These groups used racist rhetoric and discriminatory actions to try to stop James's movement. One day, as James was returning home after a long day at work, he noticed that his house was surrounded by local radical groups who were harassing him and his family. They were shouting racist slogans and waving banners with hateful slogans. The scene was frightening and demonstrated the level of hatred and hostility that James continued to face. The uncertainty and fear his family was experiencing became a huge challenge for James. While he continued to fight for social change and justice, he realized that his personal safety and the safety of his loved ones were also at risk. At that moment, he realized that his personal fight for justice could have consequences not only for him, but for his entire community. At the same time, James also saw an unexpected alliance. Many people who had previously remained silent began to speak out publicly against racism and support James. He received support from organizations that had united to protect human rights and fight discrimination. These organizations began to hold protests supporting James and condemning violence and hatred. During one of these protests, a situation erupted where activists and locals clashed with James' opponents. The protests turned violent, and a full-scale battle unfolded in the streets between those fighting for justice and those who supported prejudice and hatred. On this turbulent night, James witnessed firsthand the power of a social movement that sought change despite all odds. The events on the street attracted the attention of human rights organizations, which began to put pressure on local authorities to ensure security and take action against the aggressors. The police were forced to strengthen the protection of the area and take measures to prevent violence. In this environment, James realized that his fight was not only a personal one, but also a collective fight for the future of society. He and his allies began creating new educational programs and initiatives aimed at educating and changing public perceptions of racism and bias. Their efforts helped change public opinion and create a platform for discussion of these important topics. As a result of the fight, James and his allies were able to achieve significant changes. Hate laws were strengthened, and local governments began to actively work to eliminate racial bias in their work. The community as a whole became more united and aware, and James continued his work, inspiring others to fight for justice and equality. James' story became a symbol of change, showing that even in the most difficult times, one can find the strength to fight for truth and justice. He realized that despite all the trials, his efforts were not in vain. Every step, every effort, every action counted in creating a more just and equal society. And even if confronting racism was difficult and painful, it was an important step towards a better future. After the tumultuous events on the streets, James found that his life was no longer the same. He and his family continued to face new challenges, but the heightened public attention to his case was both a blessing and a curse. Public action and support from human rights activists had boosted his morale, but he could not ignore that his movement's enemies and opponents had also become more active. One night, after a busy day, James returned home to find that his house had been broken into again. This time, the thieves had not only destroyed his belongings, but had also left a threatening message. Written on the wall was, "If you continue to mind your own business, we know what to do with you." James was shocked, but his resolve did not weaken. He knew that these threats were just part of a larger game he was being drawn into. In addition, information began to appear in the media about secret organizations that could be connected to racist groups opposed to James. Some sources claim that these organizations have significant influence in local politics and business, and may be behind attempts to destroy James' work. Determined not to let this go unnoticed, James and his team began their own investigation. They brought in private investigators and began gathering information about possible connections between racist groups and influential figures in the area. Their efforts led to the discovery of a startling fact. Behind the scenes of the fight against racism, there was a powerful network that manipulated public opinion and used its resources to discredit and undermine movements aimed at social change. During his investigation, James discovered that many of those trying to destroy his project were connected to a mysterious businessman named Grayson Wolfe. Wolfe was known for his staunch political and business interests, but few knew of his dark ties to white supremacist groups and his involvement in real estate manipulation and political intrigue. James and his team began to dig deeper into Wolfe and his connections. They discovered that Wolfe had used his resources to fund campaigns against human rights groups and support activists who opposed James. He also controlled a significant amount of real estate in the area where the events took place, and used his assets to pressure local authorities and create a climate of fear. Realizing that Wolfe was a far greater threat, James decided to take action. He and his lawyers began gathering evidence of Wolfe's criminal activities and planned a major federal investigation, but they soon realized that Wolfe was far more cunning than they had imagined. His network of influence was deeply embedded in local government, and any attempt to expose him could have serious consequences. When James and his team decided that naive attempts at exposure would not produce results, they decided to act more strategically. They began preparing for a public exposure of Wolfe, drawing attention to his crimes through the media and creating public pressure on law enforcement. At this critical moment, James learned that his own phones and computers had been hacked. Someone was watching his team's every move and knew all of their plans. This discovery strengthened his resolve to act, but also increased the level of risk. In the midst of these difficulties, James faced another challenge. There was a leak in his team. One of his trusted employees turned out to be on Wolfe's side and was passing on information about James's movements and plans. This betrayal was a huge blow to James, but he knew he could not afford to break down. Finally, James and his allies launched a risky operation to expose Wolfe's schemes in the public square. In a major press conference and a series of documentary reports, they presented irrefutable evidence of corruption, manipulation, and racist behavior linked to Wolfe. Public outrage reached a peak, and Wolfe soon found himself at the center of a federal investigation. James was able to rebuild his project and continue his work to combat racism, but the experience changed him forever. He learned that his fight for justice required not only courage and resilience, but also strategic thinking and constant vigilance. His story became a symbol of the fight against systemic injustice and a reminder that change is possible, but only if you truly fight for it. With Wolfe under investigation, James and his team expected life to return to normal, but the reality was more complex than they had hoped. The investigation, which had rocked the city, attracted national and international media attention. Interest in the case was so great that James found himself the subject of constant scrutiny from journalists, activists, and even his opponents themselves. The Wolf scandal brought about significant changes in the political landscape of the area. Local elections scheduled for the coming months became a real arena for struggle between reformers and traditional forces supporting the old order. James, although not seeking political activism, found himself drawn into this process, as his name became a symbol of change and hope for justice. Meanwhile, James continued his work to rebuild and expand his project. He organized a series of community meetings and educational programs aimed at overcoming racial bias and creating a more inclusive society. His efforts were met with recognition and support, but many questions remained about how to address the consequences of the system that Wolf and others like him were trying to uphold. Unexpectedly, James received an anonymous letter that contained threatening hints about possible attempts to sabotage his work. The letter stated that the system you have destroyed will not forget you. It was an alarming reminder that James was still under threat, and that opponents of his work could take more drastic measures. Soon after, James noticed that some of his colleagues were acting strangely. Discussions within the team became increasingly tense, and rumors of possible internal conflicts began to circulate. It turned out that information about James's internal disagreements and plans had once again leaked out, and suspicions arose that his organization might have been infiltrated by a new spy. At this time, James received an offer from an unknown source who claimed to have information about the plans of Wolf and his supporters. The source offered to meet at a designated location, but warned that the meeting could be dangerous. James, despite the risk, decided to meet, realizing that any additional information could be critical. On the appointed evening, James met with an informant in an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. The informant, hiding his face under a hood, told James about Wolf's secret plans, which included preparing new attacks on those who fight for justice. According to the informant, Wolf and his allies were preparing a series of operations to discredit and physically destroy those who got in their way. Suddenly, just as the informant gave James critical information, the warehouse was surrounded by masked men. The alarm that had been triggered earlier was triggered and James managed to evade capture, but the informant had disappeared. James returned to his team with new dangerous information and the understanding that the situation may have been much more complicated than he thought. James now faced a new challenge: to protect himself and his team from possible attacks and continue the fight against Wolf and his network. He decided to strengthen the security of his organization and actively cooperate with law enforcement agencies to prevent new threats. At the same time, James and his team continued to work to expose the corrupt politicians and businessmen who supported the system of injustice. Their efforts bore fruit. The federal investigation into Wolf began to uncover new facts about his criminal activities, and public support strengthened their case. But the situation remained tense, and James knew that the fight for justice was not over. New challenges were on the horizon, and every action could lead to unpredictable consequences. Ultimately, James became not only a symbol of the fight for justice, but also a subject of study for professionals working on issues of racism and social justice. His story inspired many, but also served as a reminder that change requires constant vigilance and determination. James continued his work, recognizing that the road to justice may be long and difficult, but that every effort counts in creating a more just world. After the warehouse meeting, James became more cautious. He worked hard to improve security measures and paid special attention to preventing information leaks. His team was determined, but still felt the tension growing. They knew that Wolf and his allies could act more decisively and radically to maintain their position and get revenge on James. One day, James received information about a secret meeting of high-profile politicians and businessmen who were connected to Wolf. This meeting could be the key to exposing a network of influence and corruption. However, to get to the meeting and collect the necessary evidence, James and his team had to take risks. The sting operation was meticulously planned. James and several of his trusted associates prepared themselves to play the role of businessmen and specialists to infiltrate the closed circle. They used forged documents and old connections to get invited to the event. On the day of the meeting, James and his team arrived at a luxurious conference center where high-profile figures were gathering. The conference room was filled with men in suits discussing financial and political matters. James felt they had to act quickly to avoid attracting attention. They were able to gain access to private conversations and soon discovered that a new campaign was being planned to discredit human rights organizations and activists. Including James, the figures involved in the conversations discussed ways to manipulate public opinion, fund false reports, and infiltrate human rights groups. However, their operation did not go unnoticed. One of the guards noticed their suspicious behavior and reported them. James and his team tried to evade capture, but they were quickly discovered. In the chaos that followed, James and his team managed to escape, but important evidence was lost. Meanwhile, the situation in the city was heating up. As Wolf's investigation continued, protests against racism and corruption grew more widespread. In some cases, the protests turned violent, leading to clashes between activists and police. James found himself under pressure from both supporters and opponents. The situation became so tense that he began receiving threats not only from Wolf supporters, but also from those considered neutral. During one of the most tense moments, James and his family received an anonymous message telling them to leave the city. The message coincided with a series of bombings that occurred in areas where activists often gathered. James felt that his life and that of his loved ones were in danger. The decision was difficult to make, but the safety of his family became a priority. James temporarily moved to another city to protect his family, but the decision didn't slow him down. He continued to coordinate his team's actions remotely and looked for new ways to gather evidence and make an impact. At this time, police and federal agents began to crack down on groups supporting Wolf. They conducted a series of arrests and raids, which led to the discovery of numerous undercover operations, but Wolf did not go down without a fight. In response to pressure from law enforcement, he began organizing his own campaigns to discredit civil rights activists and paint James as a threat to public order. James's story and his fight against systemic injustice have attracted attention not only at the national level, but also at the international level. Global media outlets have begun to cover his struggle, and his actions have become the subject of discussion in international human rights circles. He has received support from international organizations and activists, adding new pressure to Wolf and his allies. James soon learned that he had a chance to launch a new tactical attack. One of his reports found evidence that Wolf and his allies had begun using international channels to finance their operations. James and his lawyers began working with international human rights organizations and financial investigators to expose these connections. The investigation yielded shocking results. Wolf and his network were linked to several international corporations and political figures who were funding racist groups and supporting their actions on a global level. This revelation attracted even more public attention and led to international sanctions against Wolf and his organizations. James and his team continued to fight despite personal and professional trials. Their efforts began to bear fruit. Wolf and his allies were finally exposed and brought to justice. Wolf was sentenced to a long prison term for corruption and human rights crimes. These events led to significant changes in society. Laws were changed to prevent similar incidents in the future, and public opinion shifted towards greater awareness and anti-racism. James, despite many trials, continued his work to promote social justice and inclusion. James' story has left a deep mark on society. It has become a testament to the fact that even in the darkest moments of struggle, light and hope can be found. His determination and resilience in the fight against racism and corruption has inspired many and shown that change is possible if you fight for it. After Wolf and his network were exposed and convicted, James felt relieved, but he knew his work was not done. The effects of fighting systemic injustice had not only affected his personal life, but society as a whole. James continued to deal with the consequences and sought ways to use his experiences to create a more just world. Despite the social changes and reforms that followed Wolf's exposure, James noticed that some problems had not gone away. Racism and prejudice were still deeply rooted in society, and many of those who opposed his work continued to operate covertly. The dangers James had endured taught him that the work of changing public consciousness required constant attention and effort. One day, James received an unexpected offer of cooperation from one of the major international human rights organizations. They offered him to lead a new project to develop educational programs aimed at combating racism and discrimination. This opportunity gave James a chance to use his experience and knowledge for large-scale work aimed at solving problems on a global level. Together with a team of experts and researchers, James began developing courses and initiatives aimed at educating children and adults about the consequences of racism and the importance of inclusion. The project included creating educational materials, conducting workshops and trainings, and organizing international conferences on human rights. But his new mission faced challenges. Some of the countries where the programs were planned were experiencing political instability and corruption. In these places, James and his team encountered resistance from local governments and groups who were opposed to the change. James once traveled to one such country where local activists reported attempts to discredit their work. James met with activists who told him how their efforts faced constant obstacles, from funding denials to outright threats and violence. This encounter showed him that the fight for justice has many faces and that even in the most difficult circumstances, it is possible to create positive change. As James worked on the project, he began to see connections between racism and other forms of social injustice, such as economic inequality and political repression. He realized that to create lasting change, he needed to address not just issues of racism, but also complex social and economic issues. One day, while leading a workshop, James encountered a group of students who openly expressed their concerns about the complexity and scale of fighting systemic injustice. These students, representing different countries and cultures, became a symbol of the future in which the younger generation was looking for ways to solve social problems. Inspired by these young people, James decided to create a foundation to support initiatives aimed at educational programs and projects that promote social justice. This foundation has become an important tool for funding and supporting grassroots initiatives around the world. James's project attracted new allies and partners, including major international organizations and social movements. He also began to collaborate more actively with local activists, helping them find resources and support for their own initiatives. Each successful project and program became a step toward creating a more just and inclusive world. Over the next few years, James saw his work begin to have real impact. Social programs created with the support of his foundation helped improve the situation in many communities. Educational programs began to change public perceptions of racism and bias, creating new opportunities for dialogue and understanding. But James's struggle was not over. He understood that change takes time and sustained effort. He continued to work to strengthen and expand his projects, stay connected with activists around the world, and maintain the changes that had been started. James's story is not only an inspiring example of a personal fight for justice, but also a testament to the fact that lasting change is possible when people come together for a common goal. His life and work have become a symbol of how every step towards justice, though difficult, matters and contributes to a better future. Ultimately, James realized that his own journey was not just about fighting racism and corruption, but about finding ways to bring people together, create new opportunities for learning and development, and build a more just society. And while the journey was difficult and full of challenges, it also brought much hope and inspiration, reminding everyone that change is possible if fought for with determination and courage. A few years after James began actively working to create educational programs and expand his foundation, he encountered an unexpected and shocking turn of events. In the midst of his successful work and visible improvements in society, James began receiving strange messages and anonymous threatening letters. At first, he didn't pay much attention to it, thinking it might just be an attempt at intimidation. However, one day, during an important conference where James was supposed to give a keynote speech, his team discovered that their office had been broken into. At the scene of the break-in, they found threats and signs left on the wall, indicating that they might be in serious danger. Soon after, James received a message from an unknown source who claimed to have vital information about the root cause of the threats. The source also noted that a new force operating in the shadows was behind the threats. This message was accompanied by a warning of a possible tragedy that could affect him personally. James decided not to ignore the warning and agreed to meet the source at the agreed location. This meeting was arranged in a secluded area, far from his usual surroundings. The informant was hooded and did not reveal his face, but his information was shocking. He told James that a new player in the anti-racism and social justice space had begun to take action. This player, whom the informant called the Shadow, was a hidden but extremely powerful man with the resources and connections to undermine James's work. The Shadow used his connections to manipulate public opinion, fund anti-human rights campaigns, and even organize acts of violence against those advocating for change. The informant also said that Shadow has access to high-tech surveillance and control tools that allow him to remain under the radar of law enforcement. He indicated that Shadow may be connected to various business empires and even political circles, which makes him an extremely dangerous adversary. James returned to the office with new concerns. The team immediately took steps to tighten security, but internal unrest remained. Soon after, false allegations began circulating online that questioned the legitimacy of James's foundation. Stories emerged on social media that the foundation was involved in financial fraud and corruption. Despite legal audits that confirmed the transparency of its work, public opinion was manipulated and pressure on the foundation increased. James and his team faced new challenges in trying to refute false allegations and preserve the organization's reputation. One day, during a strategy meeting, James noticed that one of his closest advisors, with whom he had worked for many years, began to act suspiciously. This person began to give strange advice and act against the interests of the fund. James felt that his team might be infiltrated and decided to conduct an internal investigation. It soon became clear that this advisor was a shadow agent, planted to gather information and create internal conflict. Discovering betrayal within his team was a huge blow to James, but he knew he had to act decisively. He began using his contacts and resources to identify other potential threats and rebuild trust within his organization. In parallel, he worked with law enforcement to expose Shadow and his network. Unexpectedly, James learned that the Shadow was preparing a major operation to discredit him completely. It was a carefully planned attack, including cyber attacks, false evidence, and media manipulation. James and his team organized countermeasures to prevent disaster. They collected evidence and brought in international organizations to publicly expose the Shadow's plan. With the pressure and revelations mounting, the Shadow and its allies began to lose support and their influence began to wane. James eventually managed to bring the Shadow to the surface. The investigation revealed that the Shadow was one of the most powerful and hidden manipulators. Using his resources to destroy movements for justice, this man was arrested and his networks were exposed. James and his team were able to restore trust in their foundation and continue their work to combat racism and social injustice. The experience taught them that working to create a just world requires not only determination, but also the ability to cope with unexpected challenges and threats. James' story ended on a note of hope and rebirth. He became a symbol of strength and resilience in the fight for justice, showing that despite the darkest and most difficult moments, it is possible to find ways to change and create a future where everyone has equal opportunities. After the exposure of the Shadow and his network, James and his team felt relief, but they also realized that their work had become more complex and multifaceted. The experience of fighting an unknown and powerful enemy changed their approach to the case and led to new strategies. One day, James received an invitation from a high-profile international forum on human rights and social justice. The event brought together activists, academics, politicians, and businessmen from around the world. James saw this as a unique opportunity to expand the impact of his work and make new connections. During the forum, James met representatives from different countries who told him about similar problems in their regions. Many of them faced systemic racism, corruption, and lack of support for human rights initiatives. These meetings became a source of new ideas and inspiration for James, who decided to use his knowledge and resources to create a global network of activists and organizations working on similar issues. However, amid James's success and his efforts at international coordination, new difficulties began. A major conflict broke out in one of the countries where James's foundation supported educational programs. The local government structure and opposition groups began actively using the topic of racism and discrimination in their political games, which led to mass protests and violence. James was concerned that intervening in the conflict could worsen the situation and jeopardize the work of his foundation. He decided to proceed cautiously and focus on supporting local activists, providing them with resources and tools to address the crisis. He also organized an online conference with international experts to suggest possible solutions to the conflict and provide on-the-ground support. During this time, James met an influential businessman at the forum who offered to invest heavily in projects to combat racism and social injustice. This businessman was known for his charitable initiatives, but also had a reputation for his covert support of some controversial political actions. James, despite the potential benefits, began conducting his own investigation into the businessman and his connections. He was concerned that the support of such a person could be used for hidden purposes or manipulation. The results of the investigation were mixed. Although the businessman did support charitable projects, his connections to political groups left room for doubt. Unsure of what to do, James decided to discuss the situation with colleagues and activists. They came to the conclusion that a balanced solution was needed. James agreed to partial cooperation with the businessman, while insisting on full transparency and independence of his work. However, new complications arose as work on new projects progressed. One of the programs supported by the businessman began to suffer from local corruption. James and his team discovered that funds allocated for educational initiatives were being misused. This discovery led to a new scandal that attracted media attention and undermined the credibility of some of the foundation's projects. James took immediate action. He conducted a thorough internal investigation, and the results showed the need for restructuring and greater control over the distribution of funds. Changes were made to project management and a new financial oversight committee was created. These measures helped restore confidence in the foundation and demonstrated James's commitment to transparency and integrity. Shortly after, James received word that one of his old allies, who had been a key player in exposing the shadow, was in trouble. The man was facing allegations of financial impropriety that were being used to undermine his reputation and work. James knew that this was part of a larger campaign to discredit those who continued to fight for justice. James decided to support his ally by providing legal assistance and working to expose the false allegations. In the process, he once again encountered powerful and hidden adversaries who continued to operate behind the scenes. These new challenges were another reminder that the fight for justice is never easy. James continued his work with renewed determination, knowing that despite the obstacles and difficulties, his efforts and commitment could bring about positive change in the world. He focused on creating lasting change and supporting those who continue to fight for human rights and social justice. James' story has once again become an inspiration to many. His ability to cope with unexpected twists of fate and betrayal, as well as his determination to continue the fight, showed that even in the most difficult situations, it is possible to find ways to change and create a future where justice and equality are a reality. After James dealt with the corruption scandal and restructured the foundation, he returned to his core mission of fighting racism and social injustice. However, unexpected events in his personal and professional life brought new challenges and dramatic turns to his work. One morning, when James woke up, he found his house had been shot at. The windows were broken and offensive slogans were written on the walls. The attack, it turned out, was not only against him, but also against his work, demonstrating that the enemies of his mission were still trying to force him to back down. The police began an investigation, but no suspects were found. James knew that this could be revenge from those who felt threatened by his activities. The situation became even more complicated when James learned of a new threat posed by radical groups that had begun organizing campaigns against human rights defenders. These groups spread false rumors, manipulated public opinion, and used aggressive propaganda to undermine the foundation's work and create a climate of fear among activists. In one of the major cities where the James Foundation conducted its educational programs, protests began. At first glance, they looked like ordinary public demonstrations, but it soon became clear that behind them were organized groups that used the protests as a cover for inciting violence. A real battle unfolded in the streets, in which both civilians and protesters suffered. James and his team decided to hold an emergency meeting to assess the situation and develop a strategy. During the meeting, one of the leading activists working in the region reported new threats. Unknown people tried to contact him, demanding that he stop working with the foundation, threatening his life and the life of his family. James knew that urgent action was needed. He proposed the creation of a crisis center that would provide support and security to local activists. The team began working to establish safe shelters and organize emergency assistance for those under threat. They also stepped up their advocacy efforts, trying to bring the situation to the attention of the international community. One day, James received an unexpected message from a former ally who had previously become embroiled in complex political games. The man claimed to have information about a secret meeting of high-profile radicals and their plans to further attack human rights defenders. The meeting was to take place in a secluded location outside the city. James decided to use this information and organized a covert operation to collect evidence and expose the radicals' plans. He worked in conjunction with local journalists and international human rights organizations to ensure reliable coverage and fresh public awareness of the case. The operation was carefully planned, and James personally participated in it to collect the necessary evidence. On the ground, James discovered that radical groups were planning large-scale acts of violence and provocation to create a pretext for declaring a state of emergency and further suppressing human rights initiatives. He collected all possible evidence and passed it on to law enforcement agencies and international organizations. However, suddenly, when everything was about to be exposed, James learned that his own safety was again at risk. He began receiving threats from people who seemed to be informed of his plans and intentions. These threats were accompanied by clear signs of surveillance and stalking. To protect himself and his team, James decided to temporarily hide and work on strategy from afar, while his colleagues and partners continued to actively work to expose the plans of radicals and support local activists. Finally, thanks to the efforts of James and his team, information about the radical group's plans was revealed, leading to significant public condemnation and international backlash. The revelation drew attention to the scale of the threats facing human rights defenders and helped increase international pressure on radical groups and their supporters. After this incident, James returned to his work with a new sense of determination and dedication. He realized that the fight for justice requires not only patience and courage, but also constant attention to new challenges and threats. His work continued to have a significant impact on the fight against racism and social injustice, inspiring people around the world. James' story has become a symbol of the fight for justice and human rights, demonstrating that even in the face of constant pressure and threats, change can be achieved. His resilience and determination have become an inspiration to many, showing that no evil can ultimately suppress the desire for justice and equality. With the radical group's plans exposed and relative calm restored, James and his team resumed their work with renewed determination. They continued to expand their initiatives despite continued pressure and obstacles. However, a few months after the events, James faced a new, unexpected challenge. He received a message from an old friend and confidant who now worked for an international human rights organization. The message revealed that information had emerged internationally about a covert operation aimed at undermining the efforts of human rights groups and manipulating public opinion to perpetuate systemic racism. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that this operation was organized by a high-profile international corporation whose business interests were directly linked to supporting racist regimes and anti-democratic structures in various countries. This corporation used its resources to bribe politicians, manipulate the media, and create false narratives in order to undermine the work of human rights defenders and maintain the status quo. James and his team began to develop a counter-strategy. They organized a series of international meetings with leading human rights organizations to gather information and develop a plan of action. As they worked to expose the organization, they discovered that the corporation had connections to some of the same people who had previously supported James's work, leading to new levels of betrayal and complexity. One day, during his investigation, James learned that his old ally, the same man who had been a traitor and turned out to be an agent of the Shadow, was now working for the corporation. This ally had organized numerous events and projects to distract attention from the real issues and use fake research and data to support the corporate agenda. His actions were aimed at discrediting human rights groups and creating the false impression that anti-racism efforts were ineffective and even harmful. James decided to use this information to organize a powerful counter-campaign. He began collecting evidence and organizing public events aimed at drawing attention to the corruption and manipulation of the corporation. This included holding international press conferences, publishing exposés, and launching social media campaigns to attract public attention. In the wake of these events, James became the target of attacks from those who had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. His home was attacked again, and his team faced threats and intimidation on several occasions. However, these attacks only strengthened the resolve of James and his team, and they continued their work with even greater determination. Meanwhile, James learned that the corporation was planning to introduce a new bill that would allow it to manipulate human rights and social initiatives even more openly. This bill, if passed, could significantly weaken human rights legislation and create new barriers to the work of activists. In response, James organized an international coalition of human rights activists, lawyers, and politicians to work together to fight the bill. They began an active campaign of lobbying and explaining the dangers of the new legislation, as well as collecting signatures and holding public rallies. The campaign was successful. Public opinion, supported by James's evidence and investigations, became a powerful antidote to the corporation's plans. The bill was withdrawn, and new initiatives to combat corruption and manipulation were proposed as an alternative. These events were a significant moment in the fight for justice, showing that even in the most difficult situations, change can be achieved through united efforts and determination. James and his team once again achieved significant results despite numerous obstacles and threats. However, James knew that his work would never be done. Racism and social injustice continued to exist, and new challenges could arise at any time. He continued his work, supporting activists around the world and strengthening international connections to create lasting change and advance ideas of equality and justice. James's story became an example of how dedication and courage can overcome the most difficult obstacles. His life and work reminded everyone that the fight for justice is not only a fight for equality, but also a fight against the forces that seek to maintain inequality. His examples of resilience and determination inspired many to continue working to create a more just world despite constant challenges. After successfully opposing the corporation's plans and preventing the dangerous bill from being passed, James and his team felt they had begun to gain some ground in their fight for justice. They continued their work, inspired by their recent achievements, and were actively developing new projects to combat racism and social injustice. However, their work soon encountered another tragedy that would test the strength and determination of the entire team. One of the key activists of James's foundation, Martin, was killed under mysterious circumstances. Martin was not only a close friend of James, but also one of the most dedicated members of the team, working on projects in dangerous and unstable regions. That evening, as Martin was returning home from an important meeting, his car was blown up on the outskirts of the city. This act of violence was carefully planned and probably intended to intimidate James's team and destroy their morale. Martin left behind a family, including a wife and 2 young children, who now find themselves in a situation of uncertainty and grief. James was devastated by the loss of his friend and colleague. The tragedy caused deep sorrow among the entire team and waves of anger and solidarity around the world. Martin was known for his determination and courage, and his death came as a shock to many who knew of his contribution to the fight for justice. Following the funeral, James and his team, despite the profound loss, decided to continue their work, dedicating their efforts to Martin's memory. They launched an international campaign in his honor to raise awareness of his case and support for his advocacy work. The campaign included holding memorial events, creating a fund in Martin's memory to support families of abuse victims, and launching a global program to educate and raise awareness about racism and social injustice. But the tragedy did not end there. Within weeks of Martin's death, James learned of a new threat from the same radical groups and corporate interests that had previously sought to undermine his work. These forces began an active campaign to discredit James's foundation, spreading false accusations and propaganda through media channels. They used their resources to organize demonstrations and protests against the foundation, undermining public trust and creating new obstacles to its work. One such action was a mass protest against the foundation. Organized in the city center, the rally was planned in such a way as to provoke conflict and violence. During the rally, aggressive protesters began to attack the foundation's offices, destroying property and threatening employees. James and his team, already tested by the ordeal, tried to maintain calm and organize protection. They worked with law enforcement and human rights organizations to ensure the safety of employees and minimize disruption. However, despite their best efforts, the destruction and chaos led to the closure of several programs and the suspension of important initiatives. Amid these crises, James began to feel increasing pressure and stress. His own health began to deteriorate due to the constant stress and emotional strain. He also faced difficulties in his relationships with his team, who, despite their best efforts, began to experience burnout and self-doubt. In this situation, James realized that he needed to take a break and rethink his strategy. He went on a short vacation to recharge his batteries and clear his head. This period became a time of deep self-discovery and an understanding of the importance of maintaining his own health and the health of his team despite external challenges. During his vacation, James received an unexpected offer from an international foundation that offered support and assistance in rebuilding the work of James's foundation. The foundation was ready to provide financial assistance, resources and expertise to help cope with the crisis and continue its work. James returned to work with renewed inspiration and energy. He focused on rebuilding and expanding the program, continuing his work to expose and combat systemic racism and social injustice. A new alliance with an international foundation helped strengthen his organization and provide stability during difficult times. Meanwhile, in light of new initiatives and international support, James and his team were able to begin rebuilding their programs and creating new initiatives to address the issues exposed by the crises. They also continued their work supporting families affected by violence and educating communities on racism and human rights. The story of James and his team is a testament to the resilience and determination to fight for justice. Despite tragedy and adversity, they continue to strive for change, demonstrating that even in the darkest moments, light and hope can be found. Their work has inspired many to continue the fight for equality and justice, reminding us that in times of crisis and loss, we can find the strength to overcome adversity and create a better future. With the foundation back on track, James and his team have become more active in strategic initiatives aimed at long-term change. New partnerships with international foundations and organizations have helped strengthen their financial and resource base, enabling them to launch several major projects to combat racism and social injustice. One such project was a program to educate and raise awareness in schools and universities. This initiative included the creation of educational materials, trainings and workshops, and the development of special courses on the history of racism, its manifestations, and methods of combating it. The program also planned to create a network of schools and universities willing to actively work on issues of equality and social justice. Despite the positive changes, James's team continued to face new challenges. As the foundation's activities increase, radical groups and corporate interests began new attempts to undermine the foundation's work. They launched disinformation campaigns aimed at discrediting the foundation's initiatives and creating public discontent. One day, James received a threatening letter stating that radical groups were planning a series of attacks on the foundation's events. The letter also included photographs of the locations that would be targeted. This threat was a serious test for James and his team. They immediately began preparing for possible attacks. increasing security at events, and cooperating with law enforcement to prevent violence. On the day of one of the Foundation's largest events, dedicated to Martin's memory and the launch of a new educational program, tragedy struck. During the event, when participants were discussing important topics and giving lectures, an explosion occurred in one of the neighboring buildings, which was being used as a temporary headquarters. The explosion resulted in massive destruction and casualties. Fortunately, the main hall of the event remained untouched, but several employees and volunteers of the Foundation were seriously injured. The explosion came as a shock to the entire team and the community that supports the Foundation. Our tragedy brought a wave of support from the public and international partners, who condemned the violence and expressed their willingness to help. James was emotionally shaken, but he knew that action was needed to support the victims and continue the work of the Foundation. Following the incident, James and his team focused on recovery and support for those affected. They organized fundraising campaigns to treat the injured and help their families. At this time, a large-scale campaign was also launched to ensure safety at all Foundation events and create new safety protocols. Recovering from the attack was a complex and emotionally difficult process. During this time, James received an offer from several leading human rights organizations to hold a joint international forum to discuss new threats and challenges faced by human rights defenders in the modern world. The forum was a milestone for the James Foundation. It brought together representatives of human rights groups, politicians, academics and businessmen to discuss strategies to combat violence, disinformation and racism. The forum featured reports and research on methods to protect human rights defenders and ensure the safety of public initiatives. Despite the challenges and losses, James and his team were able to continue their work and move forward with their mission. The forum attracted significant international attention and became a platform for discussing new initiatives and partnerships. Meanwhile, James began to realize that his work could be more effective if he focused not only on directly combating racism, but also on a deeper analysis of the causes and consequences of social inequality. He initiated the creation of a think tank dedicated to studying systemic racism and developing innovative solutions to combat it. The research center began conducting comprehensive research, collaborating with universities and research institutions around the world. The research findings became the basis for new educational and advocacy programs aimed at long-term change. James's story continued to evolve, and his work, despite all the trials and tragedies, remained important and inspiring. His ability to overcome adversity and continue the fight for justice despite new challenges and losses became an example for many. Ultimately, despite all the challenges, James and his team continued to work towards a more just and equal world. They knew the path to change would not be easy, but their resilience and determination inspired others to continue the fight for human rights and social justice. James' story showed that even in the most difficult situations, light and hope can be found. His fight was not only against racism and violence, but also for the ideals of justice and equality, which inspired many people around the world. Despite the best efforts of James and his team, recovering from the attack was not only physically but also emotionally draining, leaving behind devastation and trauma. The attack on the Foundation's event had a profound impact on everyone involved in the work to combat racism and social injustice. After the explosion, James and his team worked to restore their operations and support those affected, but a series of new tragic events began to unfold in their lives. One of the injured, Michelle, an experienced coordinator and key member of the team, was in critical condition. Despite the best efforts of doctors, she died from the effects of her wound. This loss was a huge blow to the team, which lost one of its most dedicated and inspiring members. Michelle's death was another reminder of the brutality that human rights defenders face. Despite the loss and hardship, the team continued to work, but morale began to decline. James himself became a victim of stress and burnout, which affected him physically and emotionally. His inability to cope with the pressure and loss began to affect his health and ability to lead the team effectively. The situation escalated as new waves of violence and racist attacks began to unfold across the city. James discovered that radical groups had begun organizing entire campaigns to create chaos and spread racist propaganda. These groups use fear and hatred to manipulate public opinion and create an atmosphere of tension and hostility. James soon learned that his own family had become the target of threats and attacks. In one nighttime incident, unknown people broke the windows of his parents' home and left offensive messages. The attack was a personal blow to James, who felt that his fight for justice was not only putting his own life in danger, but also the lives of his loved ones. Despite these challenges, James remained determined and continued his work. He increased security measures and brought in new partners and volunteers to help combat the growing violence and threats. But despite these efforts, attacks on activists and human rights organizations continued to mount, indicating growing resistance from those who were against change. One day, James received a message that his personal data had been published online. This act of open intimidation led to even more anxiety among his team and supporters. The threats became more specific, and the safety of the foundation's employees was at risk. In the midst of all this, James was forced to make a difficult choice: abandon his activism and go into hiding to ensure the safety of his family and team, or continue the fight despite the growing threats. His decision was not an easy one, but he understood that even in the face of threats and violence, the principles of justice and equality cannot be compromised. James and his team decided to step up their efforts and reach out to international organizations and human rights groups for help and support. They began working hard to create new strategies to combat racist groups and disinformation, trying to find ways to build public trust and support. Meanwhile, the attacks and violence continued to escalate. James learned of a new wave of racist actions organized by radical groups. These actions included attacks on public spaces where the foundation held events, as well as attacks on the homes and offices of activists. During this difficult period, James received a message from one of his old friends, who was now working for a human rights organization in another country. The friend informed him that his organization had received information about plans by radical groups that were going to organize mass protests and attacks in major cities, including the city where James's foundation was working. This information was the final straw that prompted James to decide to organize an emergency international conference to discuss the new threats and develop a strategy to counter them. He brought together representatives of human rights groups, politicians, experts and activists from around the world to discuss and develop action plans. The conference presented new data on the scale and methods of racist groups, as well as proposals for increased international cooperation and the creation of safe spaces for human rights defenders. James also called for united efforts and support for those who continue to fight for justice and equality. However, even after the conference, James and his team continued to face new challenges. As they worked to create sustainable solutions, they realized that the fight for justice is a long and difficult process that requires constant attention and effort. Each victory was achieved at the cost of significant sacrifices and losses. The tragedies that James and his team experienced became emblematic of broader issues of racism and social injustice. They showed that even in the most difficult circumstances, it is necessary to continue to fight for your ideals and not allow fear and violence to stop the movement towards equality and justice. James' story, despite all the trials and losses, continued to inspire others to fight for their rights and support human rights initiatives. His resilience and determination became an example of how important it is to maintain faith in the ideals of justice and continue the fight, even when the path to change seems difficult and thorny. Despite the efforts of James and his team, time passed and tragedies did not leave them. After a successful international conference, where many strategies and proposals were developed, it seemed that James's foundation was slowly recovering and returning to normal activities, but the hope was short-lived. One cold autumn evening, James received terrible news. In a series of carefully planned attacks by radical groups on the foundation's offices and staff homes, one of its most dedicated team members, Laura, had been murdered. Laura was not only the coordinator of the foundation's education and awareness projects, but also a close friend of James. Her death was a blow James could not bear. The attack on Laura's home took place late in the evening when she returned home after a long day of work. Unknown persons broke down the door and attacked her. Laura, trying to defend herself, found herself in a difficult situation. She left behind a husband and 2 small children who were now in a terrible situation, full of grief and fear. In the wake of the tragedy, James felt his strength drained to the limit. He sank into a deep depression that affected his work and personal life. He realized that his team and loved ones were suffering from constant violence and threats, and this made him feel guilty and hopeless. The medical care and support James received could not fully cope with the weight of his experiences and grief. His own health deteriorated and he began to suffer from chronic pain and insomnia. His emotional state was reflected in the decisions he made, and this affected the effectiveness of the foundation. Without waiting for James to recover from his losses, radical groups began a new wave of attacks. They launched a campaign of disinformation and threats, targeting public events organized by the foundation. The attacks became more violent and targeted, aimed not only at physical destruction but also at moral oppression. One such attack, carried out the night before a major foundation event, resulted in massive destruction of the foundation's offices and warehouses, where all the foundation's important materials and data were stored. This act of vandalism left the foundation on the brink of bankruptcy. Its budget was depleted and its resources were destroyed. Deprived of support and allies, James felt his dreams of a just world crumbling before his eyes. Indirectly influenced by all this, James also experienced tragedy in his personal life. His relationships with loved ones began to crumble. He found himself isolated, unable to cope with guilt and deep emotional stress. His family was also threatened by increasing attacks and threats, which only worsened his internal state. The foundation, despite all efforts, became unsustainable and lost much of its former activity. James was forced to make a difficult choice: continue the fight despite the increasing difficulties, or step aside to save the remains of his family and restore his own health. He knew that continuing the fight could endanger the lives of those who supported him and his own future. Ultimately, James decided to hand over the management of the foundation to trusted individuals and take a well-deserved leave to try to recover and find a new path to fight for justice. This decision was met with a heavy heart and many tears, but it was an inevitable step toward personal healing. With James's retirement from active service, the foundation continued to operate, albeit with much reduced capacity and resources. However, despite all the difficulties, the legacy of his work lived on. His efforts to combat racism and social inequality inspired many to continue his mission and fight for change. James's story ended, but its lessons lived on. It was a tragic reminder of the high price of fighting for justice and equality. It showed that despite all the suffering and loss, ideas and dreams for a better future can live on and inspire others to start new beginnings and fight for a just world. What do you think about the tragic story of James and his team? How would you have acted in James' place? Faced with such difficulties and losses, we would like to hear your opinion. Leave your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with exciting stories and important discussions. Your support means a lot to us.